we'll get to the panel portion where hopefully we can have a chat about some of the recent developments of blockchain as well. And I will go through, we have 4 panelists that will be coming up here. If I do my job correctly, I will speak very little and let the experts do the talking. So without further ado, we will start with, bear with me, Juan Ajo Aguenico. Hopefully I said your last name right. I apologize. He is the CEO and Director of Business Development at Decentral, a leading hub for blockchain development and innovation, and the developers of JAX, a multi-platform, multi-cryptocurrency blockchain interface. He has over 6 years of professional experience in the fields of corporate and securities law, business innovation, and transformation. Thank you. Then we have Ileana Ortiz-Valiente. She is widely credited for being a trailblazer in the blockchain space, having been among the first to recognize the tremendous impact of this technology on the enterprise world. Her focus has been on exponential technology, entrepreneurship, and bridging the gap between the corporate world and the startup communities. To that end, Ileana was the catalyst getting Deloitte actively involved with all things blockchain, and is also the co-founder and strategy leader of the Rubix by Deloitte blockchain practice. Welcome. Then we have Matthew Spoke, who is the co-founder and CEO of Nuco. I just want to make sure I got that right. Started his career at Deloitte and subsequently founded the Deloitte blockchain team known as Rubix. Having spent the past 3 years working exclusively in the blockchain space, he's an established industry-leading expert committed to seeing blockchain technology achieve its full potential with enterprise markets. Matt has worked closely with some of the world's leaders, receiving global recognition in the form of conference keynotes, article references, and sought-after thought leadership. Welcome, Matthew. And then finally we have Paratosh Gambhir. Oh, okay, well, without further ado, we have Geoffrey coming back on the panel. My apologies, I did not get that there. Welcome back.
Thank you.
Kind of going down the chain, but you panelists come from unique backgrounds, but maybe let's take the business hat off just for a second and just maybe to you, if you were asked personally, what is blockchain and what does it mean to you, what would your response be?
I think coming from a legal background, to me the main aspect of blockchain was this intermediation. I think that was the aspect that drew me into it. This notion that there's a technology that goes beyond the borders, that it's not controlled by one single government, that users gain access to it without the participation of middlemen or a very limited participation from middlemen, and their control of their assets, their life, without having to use any other service. That's to me the main aspects of it, the main questions that make blockchain so fascinating.
So when I stumbled into Bitcoin a couple of years ago, I thought the subject was absolutely fascinating, and it took some time to realize that the implications were probably going to be broader than that of a digital currency. And being someone who has lived in a number of countries and travels extensively, the idea of being able to control my assets and be able to access them at any point in time, very much so echoing your sentiments, was appealing. But also coming from a corporate background and understanding how businesses are currently structured and echoing on some of the points that Jeff was making in his speech earlier, I recognize that perhaps there is going to be a fundamental paradigm shift in the collaboration frameworks, but also from a technology and software development approach. And it's very rare that you would stumble into an area that has such wide-reaching impacts, and being a bit of a generalist by nature, I jumped at the opportunity to get more involved in falling down this rabbit hole.
Yeah, I think when I started down this path, I think what really excited me about this, and the reason I kind of threw my career out the window to a certain extent and went 2 feet in, after having worked very closely with Ileana for a number of years, was that, of all the big hot topic technologies in the world emerging today, whether you're talking about data analytics or artificial intelligence or robotics or whatever the case might be. All of these I would consider being, almost uses of data to a certain extent and applications of data in different ways, where blockchain as a concept is really the only emerging trend right now that is really questioning how do we maintain and create and store that data. So it really becomes an enabler to all other trends, and that's why I think today it's probably the most relevant of emerging technologies, because it's not a standalone. We talk about these things as being very independent things, artificial intelligence versus blockchain versus Internet of Things, where they really are kind of overlapping and interconnected. And a blockchain in the future state that we're working towards kind of underlies all of that. Artificial intelligence gets driven by data that is stored on a blockchain. Robotics gets driven by machines that are connected to a blockchain. So that's why I think it's extremely impactful, because it becomes the enabler to all these other trends.
Geoffrey's right. Maybe less so. I know we did a lot of financial services related, but just from a personal point of view, what do you see blockchain at?
Well, in Cisco, the best way I can describe what we do is we connect things and people. Right? I mean, that's been the genesis of Cisco ever since we were created. And when I think about blockchain, and I think about distribution, and I think about sharing, and so on and so forth, I think about the network, and how are we going to design a network to enable all of this to happen. The other reason is that Cisco is very focused on connecting things. And so when you combine
Close to each other.
what happened to this collaboration and cooperative environment we got? But so when we think about the Internet of Things and connecting things, and you think about machines triggering something in a smart home. So for us, it's very germane to the core business that we have. And for me personally, the role I play is one that helps companies and business lines to understand how these things can change the construct of how they put themselves together, how they operate. And so for me, it's very exciting to look at something like blockchain, and to your point, look at it within this larger set of capabilities. When you combine them and you combine the power that each one brings, you can really reimagine how you operate, and that's the exciting part.
So now maybe we'll go from the very wide picture, and let's get down to the nitty-gritty on an individual level. But what are you seeing as recent kind of trends and the way things are going in your line of work? Whether you come from a legal background, you might not do as much of that now, but what is it that you're seeing on the front lines of blockchain in kind of your own space? And whoever wants to take that first, go for it.
Sure. So a couple of changes, I guess, over the years that we've been in this industry. When Bitcoin was first introduced, and you go back to those origins, it was almost an anarchist type of community of individuals who were really excited to disintermediate the traditional institutions. But over the past couple of years, as I've worked with the big banks and with other large companies, the conversation has pivoted. It started with, what is this Bitcoin thing? Followed by, okay, that sounds like a great science project. Followed by, well, maybe the science project is growing and we should pay a little bit more attention to it. Followed by, we'll take your meetings and we'll maybe talk about the strategy, but please don't tell anyone that we're meeting with you, because we don't want to be the first big company to land on the front pages of a newspaper as exploring a topic that is new, disruptive, innovative, and could potentially change the way that they fundamentally do business. But now the conversation has shifted yet again, where there is a ton of enterprise interest from across sectors. And seeing that transition, I don't think that back in 2008, 2009, the individuals behind Bitcoin could have ever foreseen such a shift.
Do you feel they're coming to you first?
Oftentimes, we're kind of the first line of defense, and because I happen to work at an organization that's pegged to this giant consultancy and broker of trust, so to speak, usually the question is, I've heard about this thing either in the media or read an article, or I've been tapped on the shoulder by the CXO of my organization and told that I'm now responsible for the blockchain portfolio. And apparently I need a POC, which stands for proof of concept. And apparently I need it yesterday. Help.
How about you?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's, that I try to continuously clarify is we talk about this as one giant topic named under this umbrella of blockchain technology. The way people refer to it is almost as if we're talking about a single thing, where there is an enormous amount of variability under this topic. Right? There is no there is no conclusion as to which blockchain, what protocol, public or private, combinations of both. There's a lot more research experimentation that needs to be done. I think where our involvement in this space is to kind of push on that front to say, well, because we haven't yet solved the call it the protocol battle, we shouldn't just jump to foregone conclusions that there are limitations in the technology today, therefore there will always be limitations in the technology, because these are things that will evolve. Bitcoin, for example, is the first and one of the protocols in the blockchain space. What often people talk about as the banking consortium of R3 is another protocol that more recently they've admitted is not a blockchain but falls under that same umbrella for the most part. We're particularly involved in the part of this industry surrounding a protocol called Ethereum, having recently founded the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance to push again that as a standard in enterprise. So I think there's a lot more work to be done. IBM shows up one day and says, hey, we've got a solution. And everybody trusts IBM and nobody gets fired for hiring them, so let's pay attention. But there's a lot more work that needs to be done objectively on what is the value of the technology, how does it work, what are the security pitfalls, and I think there's a lot of misunderstandings still. A lot of people hear things about Bitcoin and then just extrapolate that must be true of this entire category of technologies. And I think it to a certain extent discredits a lot of the really, really core engineering work and research that's still being done. So we need to give it time. It's still nascent. Not to say that there are not opportunities for real business applications today, because we are seeing applications going to market today. But the more complicated the application and the more high frequency, and if Jeff was talking about public equity trading and high frequency platforms, it needs more time to get there. So I think it's just a matter of helping people understand that blockchain is not one thing.
And to kind of play off that a bit too, there's a lot of, it kind of has the impression that, this is a very not sure thing, somewhat secure thing, this is a good way of going. But then you mentioned, being AI driven in some cases, Internet of Things. How secure is this thing called blockchain?
So I mean, inherently my default answer is more secure. Not that it can't get more secure than it is today, but I think the model, the paradigm of decentralized infrastructure versus centralized infrastructure inherently means better security, less points of vulnerability. There are ways to improve on that. There's what most people today talk about as security. It's a lack of understanding and fear of something outside of their control, right? Security in the Bitcoin context, Bitcoin is probably the most secure network on the planet, but it's outside of the control of companies that used to be in charge of security. So they don't consider it secure because it doesn't meet their definitions of security. But it has not been breached. Nobody has changed ownership of a Bitcoin. On the auxiliary layers of this technology, people have done bad implementations of wallets and exchanges. But at its core, it's probably the most secure network in place today. So I think the simple answer is it's more secure. It can improve. We have a lot. The more value we put onto it, it's $15 billion network today on the public Bitcoin network. And if you bring that down to all the other blockchain networks, you're probably talking $20 to $30 billion of value floating around. That's pretty insignificant on the global economy. So it doesn't take in the scrutiny that it would if it were trillions of dollars, but it'll get there.
What have you been seeing on the front line in your kind of day-to-day activities?
I'm going to make a little bit of what have been discussed, because this is a technology definitely that hasn't been defined exactly. All the parameters and frontiers that it's hitting haven't been properly defined. We're talking about changing paradigms constantly, which is very interesting because the technology itself is a paradigm changer. But Geoffrey talked about, for example, immutability. And while this is a topic of discussion within the community, Ethereum had an event that challenged the same concept of, is it really immutable? Are there moments where we can see that the blockchain, even if it's public, can it go retrace its steps and change some aspects that happened in it in the past? this changed also that paradigm and made the people that were looking at technology rethink what it can do, what are its security applications also. While the blockchain, while the infrastructure itself is secure, the uses of it have also proven to be very, very challenging. Today we see, from a digital wallet perspective, we see a lot of users focusing only on trading. But this is an unregulated market. So I believe there's probably more than 300 tokens on different blockchains. Bitcoin being one of them, Ether and so on. Ether and so on. Many of these were just created to be scams. Directly to be pumped, to capture users' funds, pumped, and people want to buy into them because everyone is looking for the next investment opportunity. The next Bitcoin started at 14 cents. I want to get in on that. I wanted to blow up to $100 or $200 and then cash out. They do this, the coin is pumped and then it's dropped immediately. Some people make a lot of money, a lot of people just lose their funds. Same happened with exchanges being hacked and the lack of security, exchanges setting up their systems. So we're looking at the peripherals around the technology that present that challenge. Then there's of course all the fear of, first of all, the fear of missing out, and the government's the fear of, we don't understand it, how do we regulate this? We see all this unregulated trading happening, and we already had a comment from the OSC mentioning, watch out, if you're doing an initial coin offering, which to those who are still new to the space, is very similar, it's similar to an IPO, in the sense that if I want to capture funds, if I want to raise capital, I can issue a token, people will buy into that token, and I can capture that money and put it into my business, my project, and that coin itself its price can be regulated by the market, and certain applications can be done with it. But the OSC already said, if you're doing an ICO, be careful, you might actually fall into our own regulation, and you should ask us first, before you launch this.
Right.
So governments, there have been jurisdictions that have been more open to it, England being one of them. Canada open first with a very, let's see what happens, let's see how this develops, not a very aggressive approach. Just last week I got noticed that in Mexico they're simply going to ban any payments from using blockchain because they don't understand it, and they consider it a coin that is used for money laundering.
Right.
So the immediate action is, no, let's ban it, even if we don't have the infrastructure, even if we don't know what it is, or we have the infrastructure to control it. Let's just block it.
Do you find that, just to kind of play off of that, when those darn media folk run a story about money laundering or something, does that then, and this could be for everyone, create an extra kind of barrier for you? Like, oh great, now we've got to kind of explain this again, or is there truth to it? Where there is this risk involved, and it's just part of the security element.
It definitely generates negative media, but the problem with this is that's because blockchain and Bitcoin are in the spotlight, but we forget that fiat currencies are used for money laundering. We forget that, I hope that no one here is from HSBC, but they were accused of enabling money laundering in Mexico and in other countries in Latin America. So
it happens with the health
it happens with other systems.
And I'd go one step farther and say the reason, or the fact that it's being used, let's say in the terrible market of online drug purchasing, almost proves to me the value behind it, because those markets tend to shift towards more efficient means of interaction. And although they're bad uses, they tend to be the early adopters of efficient technologies. The types of communication technologies that were being used by drug cartels are very similar to today we might consider day-to-day practice, BBM, SMS. Most of these technologies, early adopters have bad uses, but they're always looking for kind of like what's the more efficient way of operating, and then the rest of the world kind of catches up. The early days of the internet were hackers and pornographers, and that was really what it was being classified as, is this is a terrible technology that is really only being used by pornographers. And then all of a sudden everybody started saying, well, maybe there's more value here. Maybe the reason that it's being used in that context is because it drives efficiency that we could apply somewhere else. So I think these negative stories kind of miss the point in a lot of cases. The OSC, I'll not to defend the regulator, but I think I have I'm on the board of advisors to the OSC for the FinTech board of advisors, and we talked about this announcement that they made because it's, a little bit. I don't know if you wrote this article because it was a financial.
No,
Post
I do know who he is.
Because it was a little bit of like a little bit of an exaggeration in the way it was written, because the entire purpose of the OSC recently launching their new program called the Launchpad was really to encourage more of a dialogue between new technologists or people kind of trying new business models and trying to understand how these new business models trigger or don't quite trigger or don't fit into the existing boundaries of regulations, so that the regulators can be a little bit more aware of what's coming and potentially flexible in changing that. So they've said on many occasions that their intention, and although it's difficult to position this, you tell a Bitcoin exchange operator, come talk to us, we're friendly, they probably won't knock on your door. But their intention is to say, well, how can we find the right fit so the regulations aren't too heavy-handed? But it's a difficult role for a regulator, because I think one of the realizations they're coming to is that in many cases, their authority means nothing. We talked about the fact that this is borderless, that it is, all of a sudden jurisdictions don't matter anymore. And if I'm the OSC, my jurisdiction is Ontario, a transaction that exists in the ether of the Bitcoin network doesn't necessarily capture a geographical boundary. So it's difficult for them to apply.
This all definitely comes down to the newness aspect, and you'll see the impact it has on end consumers, where we're talking about news. No news is bad news because it puts a new technology on the radar of people who otherwise weren't aware of it. We operate a Bitcoin ATM. I noticed personally the spikes in usage when there's certain coverage. Good news, bad news, people are introduced to the subject. What we hope would happen is that users recognize that because it's new, there are inherent risks involved in the process. And if you're getting, for example, a Bitcoin wallet, and Jax would be an example of that, there are certain precautions that as end users you should follow, otherwise you risk potential significant losses of your financial investments. And conversely, on the other hand, you have the regulators who have at their core a mission to protect the interests of the investing public, who struggle with this idea of, well, a new technology that challenges all of the underlying assumptions of how it is that we do business. It forces people to go back to the drawing board and get a lot more creative around the relationships and the dynamics of multiple parties and stakeholders in the ecosystem.
And just a quick point, I think that as we can hear, these new technologies are really pushing a significant number of boundaries. And when you think about money, and you think about currency, who owns currency? Who owns the currency?
Central bank.
Central bank. It's a government instrument, right? So if the government feels that these capabilities or these technologies lessen their ability to control that currency, then we've got a problem there also, because that's been historically how governments manage their own economies. They decide when to devalue it. They decide when to trade it at. When we take out $1 out of our pocket, who sets the value of that? It's just paper, right? So these things are pushing on some of those other fundamentals. The other thing I would say is that, and to come back to the previous point, when we watch the evolution of something like Bitcoin or blockchain, we can go back to the internet and think about the number of standards and protocols we had in those days, right? People couldn't communicate. It wasn't easy for me to communicate with you unless we were on the same network. Now everything is seamless. So I think we naturally go through these cycles whereby standards become ubiquitous. And once it gets to that point, we still have to think about, does it fit the regulator, does it fit the government? And once these things once we find a way in which all of these different parties and their interests can be met, then we have something that we can move forward with. So I think we've got to give it some time, but we could recognize the patterns if we just go back and look at things like the internet, or even our VCRs in the days when we used to have two different standards. They all come through the same process.
So we've been kind of saying, but not saying, but so there's the OSC, there's the regulators, but then we're also saying it's something that can't be regulated. So this might be a ridiculous question, but what are they doing then? If they can't regulate it, but they want to regulate it. Like, what's the point of these discussions? Why are we speaking with them so much? Why does it matter what they think? Can't we just, do our own thing?
It's hard to exist in a vacuum, and I've had many a conversation with clients that are at a stalemate. They want to do something, but they won't. And they're sitting on the edge of their seat waiting for the regulator to tell them whether or not you can do this. But on the flip side, you have the regulators trying to survey the community and understand what should we do, and it's the chicken or the egg problem.
I mean, we're bucketing a lot of things, right? So we're bucketing,
Right.
Can the regulator regulate Bitcoin, and does blockchain matter to a regulator?
Right.
The conversations we're having with the OSC and the Canadian Securities Administration, and more recently, just the broader federal and provincial governments, is how do blockchain systems enable them to be more efficient at their jobs? And if you consider their jobs from a compliance and regulatory perspective as being the enforcer of the law, and in most cases, the enforcement of that law comes in the process of very, very human-heavy paperwork. As much as I hate to admit this, my unsexy past is I'm a chartered accountant, and most of our job was filing forms with the CRA. And those forms were to satisfy their requirements to know that companies were complying with their tax requirements, their annual filing requirements, whatever the case might be, and whether that's for annual reports around taxes, or whether that's the types of regulations hitting markets like crude oil and natural gas exchanges. So what we're proposing to the regulator is that look at a blockchain not as this scary thought, but look at it as an enabler to you. If we can imagine a future state where this is not the most attractive of use cases, but where compliance becomes automated in the software, meaning you don't need that back office of form fillers, and you also don't need the CRA or the paper pushers at the OSC, because all of this is being processed automatically through software. We're building right now a post-trade settlement system in a commodities market, which is a very heavily regulated commodities market, which today requires a lot of people to file a lot of forms on a very frequent basis. And it's expensive and burdensome on the company, but it's also expensive and burdensome on the government to actually check those forms and audit that process. So the moment you say, well, the smart contracts that are processing the entire thing, and the recording of those transactions onto a network that the regulator might have visibility into, they have a seat at the table, they're seeing this stuff happen in real time, and they can do, again, this idea of data analytics on top of a bed that is a blockchain system, meaning they can do automatic compliance. You can start providing automatic compliance as a service and remove all this, remove the CAs from the world. Don't tell the letter kid.
No. To react to that comment, not removing jobs, but certainly there's going to be an emphasis on new types of skills. And this is something we've spent a lot of time addressing in our organization, where also as a former auditor by training, we look at our audit and assurance business, and we're trying to identify what are the truly value-added activities that we undertake. What are the lower value activities that could in fact become far more efficient with the introduction of blockchain systems? What are the types of skills that we're going to need to have in these systems of the future in order to be able to provide audits and taxation services and compliance assistance in that paradigm?
Just to add, regulation, I'm not talking for wholesale regulation or total regulation of things, but regulation also grants a level of certainty. Geoffrey also spoke about selling a house and doing this in one day. But what happens if the registry or even the courts do not recognize the smart contract? You need governments to be aware of the technology, to understand it, and to say, yes, a smart contract can be enforceable before a court here in Ontario or anywhere in Canada, the world for that matter. Blockchain does present an amazing opportunity for collaboration between companies, between businesses and governments, also in audit processes and so on. However, as you mentioned, it's also borderless. I think 2 weeks ago I was speaking in front of copyright lawyers about the possibility of the music business generating their own blockchain so that they can do digital rights management, which is amazing. The application is really good. However, the warning here is, if you don't do it, there's going to be a Napster that is decentralized. That means there's not going to be a one company that you can bring down. It's going to be distributed among many nations. And to coordinate all those jurisdictions to put a stop to illegal music trading is going to be even harder. So what you want is to create a business model that, excellently well put, recognizes the user as a center of the business, and you're going to collaborate with your other competitors. You're going to do it in such a way that the quality of the service trumps any illegal model that exists. So the users say, why should I go to this system when I can always use this one? Even though it's subscription-based and weak, and there's data that support that users are happy paying subscription fees for a quality service. While this is going on, we have Bitcoin, which is a pseudonymous currency, meaning it's not completely anonymous. But there's also other currencies like Dash, Zcash, or Monero who are completely private. And I'm sure that currencies like that are scaring scaring all of the regulators because they cannot, there's no information to audit, or transparency is completely limited.
Right. But then it comes back to the barter system that everyone involved has to see the value, and if it's not respected, it's not.
But I mean, one of the challenges with it, like a basic Bitcoin transaction is the automatic comparison, because it's digital, is how does this compare to a bank transfer or a credit card payment? Where the real comparison should be to cash.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when you do a cash transfer, when you give cash to somebody, Geoffrey had a slide up there earlier, like, you know, instant settlement, peer-to-peer. He was essentially describing a cash transaction. You know, but the only difference here is I don't have to be in the same room as the person. But when I pay cash at the convenience store, they don't ask me to give them my name and address and, you know, bank account number. It's just cash. But now all of a sudden we're trying to apply the framework of credit card transactions to something that is really a cash instrument, not a credit instrument. So, you know, the idea is almost contrary to the purpose of Bitcoin. If you consider it a digital cash and not a new mechanism of credit card payments, the idea of leaving behind kind of identifying information doesn't make sense. If somebody asks you for your driver's license every time you paid cash, you'd feel very uncomfortable with that. So you can understand why the Bitcoin and kind of crypto communities are pushing back on that concept, saying the whole point of using this is to not have to identify myself. You know, I don't want the government to know that I'm buying a pack of cigarettes and therefore my insurance premiums go up. You know, that's why I pay in cash or whatever. So yeah, that's the model's a little bit, the way we're looking at it is, I think, a little bit wrong.
That's the interesting thing about this is the technology is creating the basis for at least inspiration for future models. So you can take a privacy model adapted to dark pools, to investments, but with changes that enables a regulator to look into it if needed, or to allow it to exist in a different setting, a more regular or control setting. So they are creating the inspiration for future models.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any thoughts before we change subjects?
No,
We've been
no,
around a lot.
covered a lot.
Okay. Maybe just for the sake of time, we might open it up for questions. I think, was there a microphone around? Was there any public questions? If not, we can, oh, perfect. If anyone has any questions at all for the panel. Yeah, of course.
Thank you. Geoffrey, one area that probably I know you mentioned there is healthcare, health system, hospitals, doctors, and everything else. Is that going to change as well? Would be all the records from a doctor actually having all the information on the public later as well? What's going to play out in the future?
Yeah, I think the same privacy issues arise in a medical setting, where when we go to the doctor, we go to the hospital, they record all of the information they need from us. They keep a history of what ails us, procedures we've had, and so on and so forth. So when you think about blockchain being applied to the medical system, you and I want that information to be protected. Because what if the insurance company got wind that we had an ailment? How would that affect our rates? So I think the same applications or the applicability of blockchain within the healthcare sector, is just as powerful for the protection of you and I and the privacy that it brings. So we can imagine that in every aspect of the hospital environment or the healthcare environment now, the same issues arise. Just like how we have regulation in finance, we've got regulation in healthcare. So the same challenges, the same multi-party, the same stakeholder issues come about in the healthcare sector.
anyone else? Yes.
Thank you. Just a quick question. Hi, how are you doing? So this is a fascinating debate, fascinating panel. I think that the question I have relates to precedents, regulatory precedents, and being able to leverage those globally. Often you find with regulators, if one regulator's adopted it, we'll look at it. So have there been any precedents from a regulatory perspective, and which jurisdictions or which countries would be sort of preeminent in introducing blockchain from a regulatory point of view and managing it effectively?
Maybe the wrong. It's a little bit of a dated example, but there's a couple of companies that will very publicly state that they operate in every jurisdiction in the world except for North Korea and New York State. And because New York State issued something called the BIT license about a year, maybe 18 months ago at this point, which was a relatively burdensome regulatory approach on companies that were operating in the exchange points, the in and outs of fiat currency to cryptocurrencies in the state of New York. And it, for the most part, the result of that regulation was that something like 80% of the companies operating within that, those types of business left the state of New York, either for other states in the U.S. or to leave the country in general. So I hope that doesn't become a precedent that gets set as other governments start to consider it. A more optimistic view is, states like the state of Delaware that have not only started to publish positive statements towards the technology, but have actually started adopting it themselves. The state of Delaware is now building a corporate registry system built on a blockchain. So as most people know who incorporate companies in North America, Delaware is a very, very popular state for incorporation. Within the next maybe 5, if it takes longer, 7 years, most incorporation documents filed in Delaware will be done on a blockchain. And the reason that that's kind of encouraging is in the same breath, it actually got mentioned in a court hearing in Delaware not too long ago. A judge stated that a blockchain would have solved this issue because Dole, the fruit cup company, realized that they had 12 million more outstanding shares than they thought they did. And all of a sudden, a class action lawsuit ensued for the rights of those shareholders because nobody had a proper record of 12 million. This is not an insignificant mistake.
Rounding errors.
And funny enough, in the court hearing, the judge said, well, let's wait until the state of Delaware moves all shareholdings onto a blockchain, and then we'll have solved this issue. So there's kind of positives and negatives to point to in terms of precedents that are being set.
There was just over here, a gentleman. A couple of it now.
Next, if there's one thing which blockchain has no solution about today, and that is that's something to do with the risk transfer. We can exchange, but we cannot do a transfer of risk. And this is one of the reasons why we are solving small problems. We're not solving a big problem. And the big problem or the big challenge is that non-finance data is telling finance that I know more about finance than you do. And this is a big elephant in the room. So we can keep solving small problems. If blockchain does not solve a financial problem, a financial solution, it cannot become blockchain. So what do you have? Do you have a solution of the elephant? Can you bell the elephant?
I don't know that I perfectly understood the question, but my first presumption would say I'm a blockchain purist. This is what I do on a daily basis. This is hopefully what pays the bills in the future. It doesn't pay the bills right now. We're a very early stage company, I wouldn't profess to say that this is the solution to all problems. I think this is a new tool in the tool sets of how we're going to develop applications in the future, and hopefully in the development of these tools we can allow creative people to build creative solutions. I mean, one of the reasons we pegged on to Ethereum as a core technology when we started developing our stack was the design of Ethereum when they created it, when Vitalik created it, was exactly to create a protocol flexible enough so that the creativity of future innovators would not be restricted by how the protocol was designed. It's intended to be as flexible as any possible future idea that emerges. So that's what we kind of really latched onto. So I can't profess to know the solution to your question, but we're hoping that the tools that we're building are flexible enough that somebody can solve that type of thing.
And I would say, I think the approach we take would be also important to build on that. We have to look at what is in existence today? What is in existence today is a technology, and it's the technology that was applied to solve the problems that we had in our physical system or our current construct. And I think it would be important for us to approach every problem by looking at its parts and then determining which parts are best solved by which technologies. It's not one. I want to concur that blockchain is but one. We have to look at the problem, we have to dissect the problem, and then we have to find a solution, which is a combination of perhaps many things. I think the same goes for regulation, the previous topic we had. Today we have regulation that protects you and I. There's no question about it. There are good things about the regulation and the construct and the systems that have been put in place today. If we were thinking about a new technology versus over paper or manually checking things, we have to deconstruct what is being protected, how it's being protected, and find the equivalence in this new model. So, to your point, blockchain may not solve the entire spectrum, but we have to approach it from the point of view of decomposing it and then finding the right solution. If we go forward with thinking that blockchain is the only way, we're going to leave a lot out. We're going to expose a lot of risks, and that would serve no purpose. So I think our approach to reconstructing the current operating model using the technologies of today is going to be very, very critical in terms of how we proceed with this.
There's a couple over here. We'll start here and then we'll move to you next.
Geoffrey, you mentioned scalability. If you have a truly distributed system with a lot of users, is there a theoretical limit or a practical limit as to what the blockchain can handle and how quickly it can process as the numbers rise?
I don't think I can answer the question about the physical limits, but I can say that we have to approach the design of these platforms with the idea that we go back to the fact that everybody can communicate, everybody can participate, everybody can trade. We can anticipate that the volume is going to continue to rise. Right? So when we think about scalability, we have to design in systems, and it comes back to the networks, that where we may have had processing power in the center, and we've got the pieces on the edges sending information back to process it in the center, we have to distribute that processing to the edges. We're going to have more and more ways in which we can handle that volume as that volume increases. But I don't know enough about the technical side of it to tell you where the thresholds might be. I don't know.
Yeah, this is the type of work that we're doing at NUCO. This is inside the design of a blockchain stack. Like I said earlier, these are really not one ubiquitous technology. There's many implementations, many different ways of building a blockchain. An Ethereum blockchain is very different from a Bitcoin blockchain, very different from a Corda system. So part of that is at different layers of the stack, there's been different design choices that were made in how Bitcoin works. The type of hashing or encryption algorithm that it uses. In Ethereum, the design of its virtual machine is designed in a very specific way. The types of consensus algorithms that are being developed, these are not one consensus algorithm that rules all. So what we're designing is in the enterprise setting, how do you make changes to that protocol to achieve better performance, to achieve the ability to carve out who's on the network, who's not on the network. So like the theoretical limitations of Bitcoin, although they're relatively low, there's also companies and there's efforts being done to build layers that kind of sit above the Bitcoin network. So you can kind of imagine 2 layers of transaction processing where Bitcoin almost becomes the batch processor, and then on top of it becomes a high-frequency transaction system. There's a project right now being called the Lightning Network being created that would sit on top of the Bitcoin network that would do very, very high throughput transactions, and it essentially chunk those into batches that get recorded through the Bitcoin network. But from the user's perspective, it's the same kind of uncertainty. So you can think of it in the same way that if I send an Interac e-transfer, my bank's not receiving it right away. Interac's doing this kind of day-end settlement through Payments Canada, et cetera, but peer-to-peer version of that, right? So you've got the small, very frequent transactions and these large kind of batch transactions. But I don't think there's a theoretical limit because a lot of it comes into there's other computing technologies that are at play, right? So the bandwidth restrictions of what type of internet connection you're using, or are the servers sitting on your blockchain connected by fiber optics or whatever the next generation of fiber optics is, that'll impact how quickly they can pass blocks back and forth to each other. So as general internet and computer technologies move forward, so will the capabilities of a blockchain.
There's a question here. Oh, no, actually, up here first, and then we'll go back there. Sorry.
Thank you. This question is probably best directed to Ileana. Ileana, you mentioned that you're working with the banks, to some degree, the scheduled banks. I'm just trying to understand. We all agree it's a very disruptive technology, and I think the banks probably have a large interest in what's going on. I'm trying to get my head around how are the banks looking to optimize or monetize this technology?
So I can say that the majority of the clients we're working with are looking at use cases that are both cost drivers and also revenue drivers. Most of the use cases when we were starting the preliminary conversations were around how do you simplify the back office processes that are not always the most efficient, and that's where the majority of the stats that were up on the slide earlier around 30% efficiency gains could be achieved. In a bank, there are a number of business units with a number of paper-based processes, and oftentimes step one is understanding the process flow. Step two is figuring out what needs to be digitized, and then step three is understanding what technologies do you need to bring to the table, of which blockchain might be one of them as an enablement layer for the different business units. So when we speak to stakeholders from 5 different business units who are interested in wealth management or loyalty point systems or settlement and participation in different blockchain banking consortiums, they have a different end goal. They have a different end user in mind. They have a different value proposition, but now they're all trying to coordinate to make sure that their technology efforts are not being done in complete silos, so they're able to leverage the work that's happening in one area somewhere else.
I think one of the challenges facing the banks is, the general concept of, they hold a very critical role in society today, and they're looking at new technologies as a way to kind of put, barriers and moats around that role that they play. And the blockchain is difficult because, I don't know if you would have noticed, earlier this week, the 5 banks made an announcement along with IBM and a company called SecureKey around a digital identity system that they're building. I think one of the challenges is that, the real potential of this technology is that they should not be as critical in the center of our lives. Yeah. But they're trying to use it to reinforce how critical they are in the center of our lives. And the digital identity is a good example where most people would profess that, most people close to the blockchain space would profess that the whole purpose of a digital identity on a blockchain is to give that control back to the individual. Whereas the way the banks are approaching, SecureKey and the IBM implementation is how do we make ourselves kind of we'll give you your identity as a service, we'll give you that benefit. And then you can use that identity to open an Uber account and go on Airbnb and do the rest of what you need to do in your lives. But we're securing our role as being critical in that. So the moment you go to an alternative lender or an alternative payments platform that the bank is not involved in, at least they've got a little part of the puzzle because now they're the identity that allows you in the door. So I think that model is going to be challenged because as they work on something like banking digital identity through SecureKey, somebody's going to be working on decentralized digital identity where you don't need the bank. And the value proposition to a user is going to be pretty obvious. If they're equally good solutions at the end of the day, I'll probably shift towards the one that gives me more control, gives me more ownership. And that's not an easy realization, I think, for the large financial institutions.
Or any intermediary for that matter.
I can definitely add that from the digital wallet perspective, we are that point where the banks look at it and say, that's an account that I lost. That's a user whose funds are not stored in my account. And that user can move them freely, can even cross borders with their cell phone without anyone being privy to it. And it's all under fingertips. It's free. The app is free, and the transaction fees, as you can see on the blockchain, are relatively small. So
there are very few businesses that are completely immune to what this technology might mean. Earlier this week, I was meeting with a company that's in the ATM space, traditional ATMs, and they're asking, well, what happens if people move towards a world where cash is less prominent? What is our business model? Do we have a business model? Do we partner with the companies that make the Bitcoin ATMs or the exchanges? Or should we just continue to harvest our current revenues and start planning for the next type of businesses that will open in the future?
Now, we did start a little bit later, so I'll squeeze in one more question. I think it was back here, and then just because we're a little late, you can.
Sorry, I actually have two questions, but I will just ask one. So
There's also networking afterwards. Whoever doesn't get a chance to ask questions will be around.
okay, thank you. So I know we actually talk about a lot of the roles that regulators and the governments play in the blockchain development, but I think there are actually a lot of applications could be, benefiting the regulators and the government a lot. The one that I can think of is like you can actually collect tax across borders if like all the blockchain is used for the securities registration, trading, settlements, and all other transactions. But such a large scale application actually needs government support to build up. So do you see this happen at a much later stage, or is it just a utopian idea? Like, where can a solution really start? Like, how can we actually bring the government on board? Because it's gonna help a lot and speed up the blockchain application.
I might be, and I won't speak too confidently, but I might be the only person in the blockchain space who also happened to used to work in international tax. Not many of us in the blockchain community. And one of the projects that I worked very heavily on when I was at Deloitte doing international tax, my Bitcoin days, was an OECD project that's still undergoing called BEPS, BEPS, which is base erosion and profit shifting. And it's been the collection of these OECD countries trying to figure out how to properly define jurisdictional boundaries and the overlay of tax rules when you're talking about kind of digital commerce. So, whose jurisdiction is a digital transaction that is flowing somewhere between, a French account, a Canadian e-commerce provider, an American, insurance company. It's very difficult to start defining jurisdictions for tax purposes. What I think is really, really, to your point, a blockchain really becomes enabling in the sense that most of that intelligence can really be programmed into software in the sense that I make a transaction and it determines these rules. Probably starting with something like sales tax, I think is the easiest place where you might see this start being applied. In the U.S., U.S. tax is one of the most terrifying things to come close to. In the U.S., between municipal taxes, state taxes, county taxes, federal taxes, there are 11,000 unique overlaps of jurisdictions that might apply to how you should pay sales taxes in the U.S. So, an intelligent piece of software that can automatically determine, based on GPS, based on where a transaction took place, who do I need to remit tax to? Is it the county? Is it the state? Is it the city? Is it the federal government? Automating that into software, again, from a compliance perspective, makes everybody's job easier. Nobody likes the CRA. I mean, if they were just a piece of software that took money from us on an automated basis, that would be kind of better for us, better for the government, better for everyone. So I think there's a huge opportunity there. I think that's why you'll start to see more and more central banks getting involved, because I think one of the necessary first steps is moving towards this marriage of fiat currencies issued by central banks and digital platforms like blockchain. So Project Jasper is a research project being led by the Bank of Canada around that exact topic, right? So how do you create the next version of the Canadian dollar?
I would also say maybe characteristically, why can the government just issue our tax return? Why do we have to file a tax return, right? And the reason is that perhaps there are things that they can't see. And they can't see them when they're actually occurring. So the regulator, the government, the regulatory practices that they pursue today are because they can't see what they're looking for or what they need to see. So if all of that can be captured and shared, then chances are we'll see a lot more through automation. And that is one other reason why I think all of the government, the regulator, needs to be a part of this design, because they're all part of the ecosystem in which we do commerce, right? But a lot of the things that they do are being done after the fact, right? As opposed to knowing when it's done. And if they know when it's done, things would be a whole lot easier. So it benefits them from an efficiency standpoint and from their ability to do their job and have the kind of impact that they want to have.
To make sure that we don't leave off on a sour note, it is encouraging to know that there are governments around the world who are actively looking for ways that they could become users of the technology, rather than purely looking at it from how do I regulate it and in that capacity. But you brought up a really great point, Jeff, that they need to be included as a stakeholder up front, so that as systems are designed for real-time transactional data gathering, they could be a stakeholder in revamping that system.
And their needs are taken care of in that design too.
Everyone's happy.
No, there's definitely a challenge with governments that have a more inefficient tax system. And again, speaking for Mexico, one system that updates its taxes every year through the issuance of a miscellaneous. So if they cannot even set standards that last longer than 6 years, or at least 2 years, they're going to have to update the rules on the blockchain and even connect that to other governments just to regulate international tax and to be able to audit. So while it is going to be an amazing tool once they get it on board, there's going to be a huge challenge for those governments that are not efficient.
But I think maybe the counter argument to that is that, well, what I'm noticing is a lot of the countries that are probably the most advanced in their thinking are, ironically, the least developed countries, because it's almost this a replay of this leapfrog effect where they don't have to go through landline telephones to get to mobile, right? They have really broken infrastructure today, or in some cases no infrastructure today, and as they decide to build infrastructure, they can kind of jump over this legacy technologies that our governments are using, that our systems are built on. So I think we'll see that some of these less developed economies are it'll be an easier path to adoption for them. Not to say that any government will move quickly on this, but it might be an easier path to adoption because they don't have to go through kind of the scraping out of old stuff. They can just kind of build net new.
And the motivation is that you have a burning platform and you're looking for a more efficient way.
And on that note, we will end the panel discussion. So thank you to everyone for all of this.